All right, I'm going to read from the prologue, a scene from the middle of Sean's life that opens the book. But first I'll read the dedication page for Javi and Megan.
If you'd like, you can use the microphone too.
I'll try to speak up so I don't have to use the microphone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. December 1989, New York City. I am nervously sitting in a pew near the front of St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, where John Cardinal O'Connor is about to celebrate Mass. It has been years since I attended a Catholic Mass, and even longer since I took communion, the holiest of sacraments. But that is why I am here. Looking up at the cathedral's soaring nave, I remember the awe I felt as an altar boy at St. Mary's in Iowa City, and later, the anger when the church betrayed me. It is bitterly cold, a near record low. Many parishioners wear heavy coats as they hold hymnals in gloved hands. Slush-covered boots have left a wet trail down the long center aisle. There's a puddle under my pew. The mood in the church is tense, nothing like the droning boredom of the masses of my youth. As the minutes pass, I think of the Jesuits who taught me as a child that a good Catholic acts upon the church's social teachings, even if that means confronting the church. My hands are trembling with the cold, my apprehension, and other feelings too deep to name. Outside St. Patrick's, 4,500 angry men and women have assembled, packing Fifth Avenue and chanting and waving placards that read, "Curb your dogma," "Papal bull," and "Condoms, not coffins." Fists pump the air, bullhorns blare. ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, first mention, is protesting O'Connor's assault on safe sex and reproductive rights. There is an almost carnival-like spirit to the demonstration, with ACT UP affinity groups such as Church Ladies for Choice, the Hail Marys, and Speaking in Tongues performing their protests. In ACT UP, high camp and high seriousness are uniquely compatible. An artist named Ray Navarro is dressed as Jesus Christ, swathed in a white shroud, carrying a large wooden cross over his near skeletal shoulder. His bearded face is gaunt, and he wears a crown of thorns over his long, thinning hair. Despite the cold, Ray looks beatific. He will be dead in less than a year. Keith Haring is there too, in a knitted cap with a long, hand-knitted scarf wrapped around his slender neck. He has 2 months left. Inside the cathedral, O'Connor's Mass is interrupted again and again by ACT UP protesters. Surreptitiously spread throughout the church, they stand up and yell out their statements. My friend Michael Petrellis climbs on a pew and shouts, "O'Connor, you're killing us." Another friend, Jamie Leo, dressed as a priest near the front of the church, offers up a prayer in protest. 2 boyfriends in black leather motorcycle jackets handcuff themselves to one pew. Right after O'Connor begins his homily, 30 protesters stage a die-in, blowing whistles, throwing hundreds of condoms in the air, and going limp in the center aisle. The cops, 2 long lines of blue on either side of the cathedral, have their moment, binding wrists with plastic handcuffs and carrying the protesters away on stretchers, as if they were taking them to a hospital rather than to paddy wagons. With his homily in tatters, O'Connor retreats from the altar to his throne-like chair. He sits with his head in his hands, melodramatically trying to convey spiritual pain. Photographs of the media-savvy cardinal looking tragically besieged will elicit overwhelming sympathy when they appear on the front page of Monday's newspapers. Communion begins amid the general confusion. ACT UP protesters line up, interspersed among the regular parishioners. But when it is their turn, they make loud political pronouncements. Safe sex is moral sex. I support a woman's right to choose. Condoms save lives. Soon it is my turn to receive the body and blood of Christ. A small, dark-skinned priest is serving my cue. His white, green, and gold vestments are oversized and bright. He hesitates briefly, his eyes fixed on the pink triangle and silence equals death logo, visible on the t-shirt underneath my coat. Then he holds the host in the air and intones with a strong Spanish accent, the body of Christ. This is the moment, my moment to confront the church, when instead of repeating the body of Christ as expected, I am to make my political statement, but I have not prepared one. When I rehearsed this moment in my mind, I imagined I might break into tears or erupt in rage because no slogan, in fact no words at all, seemed adequate. May the Lord bless the man I love, who died a year ago this week, I hear myself say. My voice begins as a tremble, but finishes strong. Police standing a few feet away are ready to intervene, watching to see how the priest reacts. His hand jerks slightly, but he looks me in the eye and gives me the wafer. With my heart pounding, I walk back to my pew. My mind is fixed on bodies, but not the body of Christ. I think of Michael's body and the agonizing brain infection that turned his last days into a kind of crucifixion. I think of the bodies of the protesters carried out on stretchers and those chanting outside, many struggling to survive. I think of my own body, wondering how much longer it will last. Parishioners are staring at me, their faces disgusted or sympathetic or just plain stunned. Some have their heads bowed, hands pressed tightly in prayer, like the devout at St. Mary's, their faith unshakable and unwilling to brook any criticism of the church. They might be praying for us. After Mass, I pass through the cathedral's heavy doors into the bright sunlight, and, it seems to me, into the arms of my true community. I am exultant, in a state that feels like grace, certain that if I am to die of AIDS, I will die as a fighter, not a victim. So, that's beautiful.
Walter, can you use the microphone? You can use the microphone.
I'm sorry.
Sure.
Did you hear that?
Yeah, but it's just...
Easier with the mic.
Hello?
That demonstration was a very important moment for me personally and cathartic, and probably about, in terms of dealing with my parents, the most difficult thing other than actually when I came out to them. And it actually was probably closer to the challenge of that moment than people realize, because of the how important the church is to my parents. And I don't mean this in an unkind way, but almost certainly competitive with the importance of their children. But beyond what it was to me personally, I think, at the time it was immensely controversial within ACT UP. It was debated all summer long. There were people who were angry about it. It was the most intense and divisive proposed demonstration in my experience at ACT UP. And the next morning, everybody had their press releases out condemning us. GMHC, Gay Men's Health Crisis, was condemning us. 10 o'clock the next morning, the press release was going out on the fax machines. But over time, I think that people's perspective on that demonstration has changed somewhat. And to me, in 1969, when the protests after the Stonewall Rebellion or riots was the first time that the gay community had really pushed back against the civil code that oppressed us, and really had challenged it and fought it. 20 years later at St. Patrick's, that was really the first time we had a similar pushback against the religious code, where we really took it to the church and challenged it in such a fundamental way. And I think that coincided, not just for that reason, but for others, with a moment of sort of peak influence of the Catholic Church in America in terms of partisan politics. The church is not as powerful in the political sphere today as it was then. And the one other comment I want to make about that demonstration, since I jumped in here before Walter could ask me a question, is the 110 people arrested that day, roughly half inside the church and half outside the church. I talk about this a little bit later in the book. Of the ones inside the church, if you look at the names, they're overwhelmingly clearly culturally Catholic. They're Irish, they're Italian, they're Polish, because those of us, who were raised in that tradition, I figured out one time that I had attended more than 1,000 masses in my life. Still felt we had some right to go and seek redress right there at the church. I couldn't imagine going to a synagogue and doing a similar protest. It just was not, anything that I would have even considered. But you still retain some ownership of the church and some right. It isn't just the Cardinal's Cathedral. Over time, my participation in that is something I'm increasingly proud of. At the time it was difficult, it was scary, and it was controversial and divisive, but I'm awfully glad I did it.
The only thing I would add is that that was the moment when Women's Health and Action Mobilization, WHAM, was at its peak and in the peak collaboration with ACT UP, and it was to me it was the two issues and the two forces that came together that made it really just such a powerful show of resistance to the dogma and the history. So
and they were an equal sponsor of the demonstration with ACT UP.
Exactly.
But their brand hasn't endured in quite the same way, so ACT UP gets the credit for the demo.
Why did you choose the title Body Counts?
It wasn't... it was a title that arose in the middle of the process. We were trying to find a title. I think of other titles we considered, and am really glad we settled on this one. But the reason it made sense to me, it came out of a conversation with a 20 or 21-year-old guy named Matthew Vidam, who I met when I spoke at Simon's Rock at Bard College, and he's just a really unusually deep thinker, and was really interested in my story. And as we talked more and more, and he started to read bits and pieces of things that I had written, he one evening started telling me, he says, the theme of your life is really about controlling your body and struggling for control of your body as a child from those who were abusing me, as a young adult struggling to, own my own sexuality, taking it really from the church. Certainly a struggle with the virus, a struggle with the meds since then. And that's also consistent with really the political consciousness that was so formative for me as a 10, 11, 12-year-old, getting engaged in feminism and really being influenced by the feminist movement in the late 60s and the early 70s, which was really around reproductive rights and control of one's body. That was a very natural transition to me, and it also brought me into the epidemic already seeing healthcare in political terms.
The only thing I will add to that is that Sean was a very late bloomer in terms of your growth in hormones. And there were also gaps in his understanding of gay sex, so I would love him to talk about his understanding of the day that he understood that anal intercourse was a real thing.
Well, what Walter's referring to is an anecdote in the book so I'm, in Washington, I'm 17, I'm 18 years old. I was precocious. I was really, could, speak as an adult on all sorts of political things, but was, now I look back, remarkably uninformed about my own body, physically about my body. I knew nothing about my body. I knew very little about sexuality other than, what I picked up at the playground. No one ever had a birds and the bees conversation with me. There was no internet. When Dr. David Rubin's book, Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Sex But Were Afraid to Ask, came out, that was, I learned more from that than I had from anywhere else. My parents had it under their mattress. And Dr. David Rubin, if any of you remember that book, and any of you, like me, looked up the parts on homosexuality, it was pretty miserable. You were destined to this lonely, awful life, and you wore engineer boots or engineer trousers, whatever those were. It was engineer trousers, right? I think it's like the blue and white stripy thing. Laura has some right now. But it didn't talk explicitly about anal intercourse. And so as I started to pick up bits and pieces and go into the card catalog, and I'd see references to men having sex as though they were having intercourse, and I didn't believe that was possible. and I actually thought that it was just sort of like a play acting. It was sort of a simulation is what they called that. And I became increasingly confused. And it was almost like, when you start to doubt whether Santa Claus exists, you just don't know, And so I tell the story in the book about going to a dirty bookstore in Washington and going into the little, cabine and dropping my quarters in and looking close and deciding that it was not trick photography. And not only that, but it, whatever the film was, they actually looked like they were enjoying it. So Walter gets a charge out of that story, the idea that I could be so naive. And actually someone else who read the book.
Well, you were 35.
No, Joe Sonnabend picked out that specific thing. He said, now that's not really true, is it? And it's absolutely, totally true. It's maybe embarrassing to admit, but it's totally true.
Well, it just illustrates the kinds of gaps in gay knowledge of all kinds that can be transmitted from generation to generation, or just, especially in the late 70s, having to find out so much on your own in secret.
But also how dangerous that ignorance is. Not teaching people about their sexuality in a healthy and supportive way, or about their bodies.
The book pays tribute to many of the people you have known who died of AIDS. In writing the book, what was it like to remember them and to put them down on paper? And that's a deep question, but I'd also like you to talk about the Googling that you did to try to track guys that Sean had known in the 70s and in the 80s who he'd lost touch with and hadn't spoken to in maybe since before the epidemic. And if any of you have ever tried to search for someone, a lost friend from before the internet age, I mean, and there's a good chance that they're dead, it's a very emotional process.
My friend Amy Ferris wrote a book about, she talked about Googling old boyfriends at 2 o'clock in the morning and that sort of peculiar thing. I was, when I started working on the book, I knew there were people whose work and lives were so important and so meaningful in a broader way to the community, like Stephen Gendon, that I was going to write about them. But then, as I started, sort of working on the part of the book that was really about me and my relationships, and going back and thinking about different people I had known or dated, and becoming curious about them. First of all, wondering if they were still alive, and some of the ones I tracked down weren't. But there are a number of them that I talk about in the book, and one guy I did find who I talk about in the book, and his recollections of our meeting in that time were very, very different from mine. He doesn't remember himself being in the closet at all. He thought he had sort of was a mentor to me in gay activism, and no, he didn't tell me that he had a girlfriend and all these things. That was just a woman he worked with, and it could not be more different than my recollection. Another I write about in the book was a very gentle guy who I dated and was very protective of me, and he had no idea how important that was to me at the time, and I think was just incredibly touched that and I've actually had dinner with him and his boyfriend a couple of times since then. Another guy who was one of the very first people I met when I started going to the Lost and Found, the gay bar in Washington. He and his boyfriend are so ultra right-wing, rabid Republicans. I kind of oh my God, I wish I hadn't known. So that was kind of, but it was also, it wasn't just about finding out about them, but them telling me, reflecting back to me their memories and recollections, and some of them had followed my career, known about Paz. Others had absolutely no idea, and it helped fill in all the pieces. Some people have commented on how much detail there is in the book, and I didn't just remember it all. I mean, I went back and talked to people, and read contemporaneous news reports about events. At one point, I actually printed out. You can find on the web. Every year the major news events. Month by month or week by week, and I found that very helpful. Because I was such a news junkie. I remembered those much more than sometimes I remember where I read that or what I was doing at that time or how that. And it also became, my own kind of, you discover how unreliable your own memory is. There were things that I would have, bet anything were this way. And when I got into it, I discovered irrefutable evidence that, in fact, it was different than I remembered it.
I just want to point out that some of us would have been satisfied with just doing the fact-checking and finding out living or dead. But Sean contacted them, invited them to Milford. He's resumed relationships with them. So, it's an ongoing process, which is very interesting. I don't know if you're prepared for this question, but during the time you were writing, 2 ACT UP documentaries came out, as did other works about AIDS history. You were very alert to these films and to how they were received. In what ways did these films and other work about AIDS coming out influence you as you were writing the book?
More than anything else, is an affirmation that I felt like I was doing something that it was very important to me. I had resisted, actually, writing about the epidemic. And when I decided I wanted to write a book, and I started talking with my friends Bob and Suzanne Levine about it, they kept saying, well, you need to write about what you know and about the epidemic. I said, I don't want to write about the epidemic. I want to do something new and different. I want to look, and I actually went out to Oregon and I interviewed a bunch of people about it was the 10-year anniversary of the physician-assisted suicide, physician-assisted dying statute in Oregon. And I was so sick when that was being debated, the ballot initiative, and was watching it on the news all day long. I was just fascinated with it. I was even, I was a guest on one of the cable shows talking about it one time, and how that had been important for a number of people with AIDS who wanted to end their lives. And there were all these horrible things predicted that if this passed, and it was then 10 years that had been in place, and I was like curious, what actually happened, and found all sorts of fascinating things. But then I became confused a little bit about my own views on it, and so then I looked at doing something else about gender. Then I was interviewed by Michael Weinrib in the New York Times, who was writing a column about midlife things, and he wanted to talk to people who had survived, being very ill and looking at their life, 15 or 20 years later. And as I started talking to him, and it was a really wonderful conversation, it got intense, and I was like trying to convey to him what it was like then, and then I started saying, the people are dying. There are fewer and fewer people who know that. I said, somebody has to be the memory, and he put that in the paper, and I was reading it, and I was saying, somebody has to be the memory, and I was like, I'm one of those people who has to be the memory. So then, that was really kind of like a click that that I needed to do this. It was important to do it. There were fewer and fewer people around who are alive to tell the story of what happened at that time. And then these other films and other things started coming out, and it's real easy to be critical of someone else's interpretation of history you've lived yourself, so that I think even motivated me more, particularly the ACT UPification of epidemic history. ACT UP was incredibly important to me. I write about it a lot in the book. I think my participation in ACT UP ultimately was one of the really important factors that enabled me to survive. But when ACT UP was founded, first of all, Randy Shilts had already written and the band played on when ACT UP was founded. There was a whole history before ACT UP. And in many ways, I think that the history that preceded ACT UP, the epidemic history that preceded, are we that close to time?
Keep going.
Okay, the history that preceded ACT UP. Sorry, I was just warming up. The history that preceded ACT UP, in some ways, I think was more radical, and it certainly had a bigger influence on me in terms of shaping my perspective on my advocacy. And that was the People with AIDS Coalition and the Denver Principles and the self-empowerment movement that was really modeled after the women's health movement, where people with AIDS were really doing everything themselves. We were starting organizations to control the research agenda. We were starting organizations to provide the care. We were not expecting the government to do these things for us. We were mad at them. We were disgusted. We would protest, but we weren't waiting for them. We were just going ahead and doing it, creating our own publications, being doing our own.
And there was a really deep mistrust from the 70s of anything that the government.
Right. I mean, our whole lives, the government had not, no institution of power had cared for us. Not the churches, not the government, not the schools we went to, not our families. And so suddenly, because we now have a life-threatening illness, that we are going to turn to them and expect them to be our saviors, it wasn't going to happen. So when Michael Callan and Richard Berkowitz and Bobby Campbell and Dan Turner and a group of about a dozen guys with AIDS gathered in Denver, Colorado, it was the very first time that a group of people with AIDS from around the country got together to organize and assert a political voice and say, we have a right to be involved in this decision making. It's about us. It's our lives. You can't go and do this without us. That was very important. They created a document, a manifesto called the Denver Principles, which I refer to as the Constitution and Magna Carta and Bill of Rights all rolled up into one, not just for people with AIDS, but for people who are facing life-threatening illnesses and are sort of pharmaceutically tethered for their survival. And that was the very first time in the history of humanity that people who shared a disease organized and asserted a political voice. It had never, ever happened before. And from that, we then created this whole service delivery structure that was peer-to-peer. You know, they didn't have board meetings where they talked about them, the clients, because the clients were also sitting on the board. And over time, that service delivery infrastructure that we created, Gay Men's Health Crisis, AIDS Project Los Angeles, San Francisco AIDS Foundation, and hundreds of other organizations, most of them have incrementally moved away from the peer-to-peer service delivery model that was radical and that we pioneered, that we created in a practical way, actually, you know, realized. They've moved back towards the more traditional benefactor-victim service delivery model. And that's part of what, you know, my advocacy is about these days in the book, is to really, you know, get people to understand that, and how do we start moving them incrementally back towards this peer-to-peer service delivery model, which I think is actually ultimately less costly and has better health outcomes. So I felt that, you know, then when ACT UP started, it was, you know, also important, very different. It wasn't about people with AIDS doing these things for themselves. It was about people with AIDS getting together and putting pressure on the government and speeding up the drug delivery process and you know, doing these sorts of things. And ultimately, it became mostly about treatment activism, you know, because the drugs were in the pipeline and they were just beyond our grasp, and there was, you know, this one come out, it'd help a little bit for a while, and we were so focused on that, that all of the other issues, these sort of human rights related issues, the broader empowerment issues, dealing with stigma, patient autonomy, ended up getting sidelined. And that's where AIDS advocacy began. And so then through the 90s, the AIDS activist movement was mostly around treatment activism. And now, in the last few years, I think people have realized we are not going to treat our way out of the epidemic. Stigma isn't going to go away with a pill. And I think there's been a little bit of a renaissance in looking at the human rights-based approach to the epidemic, which I also write about towards the end of the book in the Sero project, the work that I'm engaged in now. So, you know, seeing other people, other cultural production, right? The exhibits, the films, the books. You know, it's the easiest thing in the world is to point out what they didn't do. So, rather than just be unhappy, I tried to sort of document some of that.
I just wanted to say we are running a little low on time. If there are any audience questions, I wanted to open it up to you guys too.
I guess I wanted to disagree maybe on the treat our way out of the academic statement. Because there's so much talk of treatment as prevention and PrEP and PEP, and I think a lot of people are saying, oh, we'll just throw the pill at it, and then we can all end AIDS and all those sort of sloganeerings, and I feel like a lot of the attention is going there. So what are your thoughts considering that kind of energy in reflection on what you just said?
Well, I think there is a lot of talk. I mean, sort of like sort of an establishment, a public health establishment in the pharmaceutical industry that is focused primarily on that, and there's a lot of very important things in that. You know, post-exposure prophylaxis works. It is a crime that it is not readily available, that there's not a 24-hour hotline that will come and deliver it to people when they have been exposed. And yet, with all the talk about biomedical prevention, there's not an effort in actually making that available to people. Instead, there's a focus on giving drugs to people who don't have HIV. You know, rather than giving them the life skills, teaching them how to be healthy about their sexuality and how to integrate information into their behavior, it's just give them a pill and create a market. By the way, you hear all this disappointment about, oh, you know, gay men aren't taking PrEP, the pre-exposure prophylaxis, to avoid getting HIV, and you know, and the explanation is that, oh, the AIDS organizations and the government are not promoting it enough, so let's put more money into promoting it. I actually think that a lot of it is an awful lot of people who are HIV negative, they know how to avoid HIV other ways. They don't want to take a pill that has side effects that can't be predicted. Some of them do, and that should be available for them. You know, and some of them it becomes about controlling a prevention method that your partner doesn't know about. People in abusive relationships, people who have partners who won't use condoms, right? That gives them something to protect themselves. Some of the time it's economic, very often with people who have to rely on sex work to earn a living. So it's not that I am against PrEP. And certainly, you know, a boy who's going to go on a binge, you know, rather have him taking PrEP than not. But the idea that we are going to go out with millions and millions, tens of millions of gay men and put them on pre-exposure prophylaxis and, you know, bankrupt the economy to sort of spray people with Raid rather than changing the conditions in their lives that will enable them to make healthier choices about their sexuality and sexual expression, I think is just fundamentally misguided.
Related to that, because I think you're talking about resources, and so I want to go to, you mentioned Zero, but I want to know, because one of the things that impressed me about, full disclosure, Sean was my boss when I was first hired at Paz. Both of these characters were. And, you know, I wasn't used to thinking that a boss would be the person who would most respond to my interest, because I had been in prison in HIV in prison and all those things. So how did you get to Zero? How did you get to choosing out of all the things? Because I do think it's interesting, out of all the people that we knew or know of from those times, how people with HIV, where did they end up? Some end up in pharmacy and some end up in activism. How did you end up out of all of that in Zero, in fighting HIV criminalization?
Right, because I didn't start there. I mean, I came into the epidemic with a political background, a little bit of a social justice background, which is maybe different than a lot of, you know, of my peers who came into the epidemic specifically, you know, it was the first time they were engaged politically, and they're very focused on saving themselves, and understandably, and many of them then left this work when they weren't so frightened of dying after combination therapy came out. But through the magazine, and it was really, you know, when we started the magazine, it was immediately of Paz accused of, oh, it was, you know, going to be a flashy thing for gay white men. And it was so conscious and intentional from the very beginning that it not be that. But as the longer we were publishing it, the more I realized how much I personally had to learn in order for it not to be that. I couldn't just make a decision for it not to be that. And as we became more intentional about our coverage in different communities affected, and I sort of became more and more aware, my interest started going to you know, the most disenfranchised communities. When we hired you, Laura, you know, she says that we were her boss, but I can't remember a time that Walter or I ever didn't do anything she asked us to do. You know, she's.
We used to have each other in tears, as I recall.
But then this criminalization phenomenon, prosecuting people, using one's HIV status inappropriately in a criminal prosecution, right? Sort of most well known around people who don't disclose before they have sex with someone else, and they are prosecuted and put in jail. Independent of whether there's any risk or any transmission or anything like that. That is, you know, basically valuing what I actually think is an arrogance of people who are HIV negative, who believe it is the rest of the world's responsibility to protect them over the privacy rights of people who are HIV positive. It is, you know, undercuts the most basic message about sexual health, which is that ultimately you must be responsible for yourselves. Not that not disclosing or putting someone at risk is benign. It isn't. You know, that it's not the right thing to do. But making it criminal becomes another thing, particularly when you do it just with HIV and not with other. So this criminalization thing, there started to be these cases of people being prosecuted, and Laura was really the person who put it on my radar screen, and under Walter's editorship, where did it come from, though? Did it was
your idea.
Yes, I'm sure it was your idea. But whatever. Well, I remember that whenever we'd see these articles, I always wanted them, you know, we'd hear about some horrible case somewhere, and we'd do a little blurb on it. And in February of 15 years ago, of 1998, I wrote a column because it was when enough of the AIDS activists has sort of gone to the other side, right? They were working in these organizations, and inevitably you have to execute the agenda of the organization, and inevitably many of them start to adopt that as their own personal belief system. They think that they're doing things. And what happens is that instead of representing the community to the institutions of power, you end up doing the reverse. You actually end up representing, it's like, the Empire State Pride Agenda put out a press release about Cuomo's budget the other day that was, gagged me. It was like saying, oh, it's not too bad, it's not too bad, and it's horrible and doesn't deal with the rent cap. So that was happening in the mid-90s, and one of the consequences of that was that we lost anonymous testing, and there started to be mandatory names reporting of everybody who's positive, reported to the government, be put on these lists, which are being abused in all sorts of ways. If you test positive in New York State, the New York City Health Department not only gets your name and tracks you, but they want to be able to, if you move to rural Pike County, Pennsylvania, if you move to Dingman's Ferry, Pennsylvania, and they find out, they want to be able to call up the health department in rural Pike County, Pennsylvania and say, hey, this person with HIV has moved into your community. They haven't gotten this through the New York State legislature yet, but that was their proposal. So this is just one example of the abuses. And so when that was happening, I saw, probably because Laura told me, that this mandatory names reporting was going to lead to these kinds of abuses. And I wrote this column in February of 1998, predicting this criminalization wave. And it was lovely to kind of predict it, but then I didn't really do anything about it for 7 or 8 years until the cases seemed to be becoming more and more intense. And then one case in particular, and because it was someone like me, we pay attention most to things most like ourselves, a young man from Iowa, a white guy, grew up on a farm in Plainfield, Iowa, met someone online and they had sex in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Everybody agrees he used a condom. Everybody agrees he had an undetectable viral load. And the partner then finds out, here's that Nick has HIV, turns him into the police. Nick is prosecuted, sentenced to 25 years in prison. And no HIV transmission. There's rarely HIV transmission in these cases. And I was so rattled by that. And fortunately, after a year, he got out. He still has lifetime sex offender registration. You can see a film, sarahproject.com tells about it. That I really realized that this criminalization was imposing a horrific injustice on people with HIV. There were hundreds of these cases, and that it was a driver of stigma in a huge way, and ultimately translated into being horrible public health policy, because you can't be prosecuted if you don't know you have the virus. So it discourages people from getting tested. It penalizes the responsible behavior, knowing your status, and privileges that ignorance. And most new transmissions come from people who don't know they have it. They don't come from people who've been tested. They come from people who have HIV and don't know it, and who are not subject to prosecution. So I first started by going to some of the big AIDS organizations that I felt should be doing this work, and didn't get very far with that. There's no funding stream attached to it. They're all struggling to keep their doors open to continue to provide the basic services that they provide. So then I began spending more time on it, and found a few other people who were interested in it. Some people who had done some documentation of some of the cases, and we launched an advocacy effort that is now growing quite rapidly, and we have efforts in a number of states to change these statutes, and we have a conference this summer at Grinnell College on criminalization. So that's the trajectory of it, and it also comes from feeling like where you can make a difference. This was something I knew something about, and I guess I also became angry that the AIDS establishment wasn't dealing with it, and so in the kind of Michael Callan, Richard Berkowitz self-empowerment mode, I decided to do it myself.
I think. Oh, okay. One last question.
So, Sean, thank you very much for helping us remember the epidemic and learn more about it. I really enjoyed the passage you read. I'm raised Catholic. I'm wondering, what's your relation? All these personal reflections in the book. So, if you would indulge us with one more, what's your relationship with the church now?
I I don't know. I mean, I don't, like, personally, I've sort of processed it. I don't, like, get furiously angry, but, whenever I see my dad, I know there's nothing more he wants than for me to go to Mass with him. After my mom died, it was pretty tough not to, I have a respect for people's faith. I certainly have a respect for my father's faith, how important it is to him.
What about when you became the godfather? Having to
Right. Okay. So my older brother, in 1992 or whatever, when his son was born, and he and his wife asked me to be the godfather to his son, his little boy. And my first thing was, the church is never going to let me be the godfather. St. Mary's, like, Mr. Act Up. And oh no, they were sure they wanted to do it. This was also at a time when, they thought I was dying and everything else. And so, fine, I decided if that's important to them, I'll do it, say whatever I need to say. In any case, in theory, it put me in charge of this child's spiritual development, so I could make sure he developed properly spiritually. And so when I get to Iowa City, my dad tells me that I have to go down as the godfather. I have to be at the church, an hour before and meet with the priest. I'd never been godfather before. I didn't know. And so we go down on Jefferson Street next to the church, and this is like, sort of my heart of my family. My parents are married there. My grandparents are married there. Great-grandparents are married. My father grew up 2 blocks away. The store was a couple blocks away. And the rectory was right next door. Knock on the door, and the elderly housekeeper was there, kind of looked me up and down, set me in the parlor. The priest comes in. I hadn't met him before. First of all he wants to talk about is Act Up. He wants to know about the St. Patrick's, and then it's like, and O'Connor did what? He was like totally into it. And then as it was getting time to get ready to go, he said, okay. He said, I think I need to rebaptize you. Now this is a sacrament that does not exist in the Catholic Church, right? He sort of made it up, which seems to be a tradition since my father baptized my sister's baby since she wouldn't take him to a church. But, so he sprinkled the holy water on me. I didn't burst into flames or anything, and I just kind of like, fine, I'll kind of go through with it. So that was, my intense anger has passed. I've kind of like had my say, and I feel like they've heard it. And I don't see the church. It still is an enormous problem in all sorts of ways, but not quite as high on the list of obstacles to the epidemic as it was 20 years ago.
All right.
And you're probably a great guide to spiritual development.
There you go. Well, I briefly wanted to be a priest. When I was 13 years old, I was thinking I had a calling, and it was actually kind of an escape hatch. People would stop asking me, about dating girls or having kids or whatever like that. And sometimes I try and convince my father that I've just pursued a vocation in a different way.
That's about all we've got time for tonight, but thank you so much to both of you guys for coming out, and thanks to everyone who braved the cold.